Good morning and welcome to today's Equitable Services Workshop. Equitable Services is a requirement for only districts. So if you're here from a charter school, we welcome you, but just know that the Equitable Services is not a requirement for charter schools. I am Adrienne Balcazar, and I would like to introduce the LCAP State and Federal Programs Unit. Joining us today is Debbie Cano,
Good morning, everyone.
Helen Choi,
Good morning.
Laurel Estrada,
Good morning.
Augustine Garcia,
Good morning, everyone.
Rachel Garcia,
Good morning, everyone.
Jeannie Keith,
Good morning.
and Anita Lomali.
Buenos días.
And also joining us today is our support staff, April Grease.
Good morning.
And Susanna Mendoza.
Good morning.
Great. To access today's presentation, we ask you to click on the link in the chat, and this will take you directly to the slides. If you use the link at the top of our slide here, this will take you to our Canvas page. This presentation can be accessed through the icon as shown here, as well as the agenda and other resources. Looking at today's workshop, we'll start with an overview of equitable services, the consultation, the equitable share, the other federal programs of equitable share, the key requirements, looking at public control of funds, allowable uses, obligation of funds. And we will end with the requirements of equitable services in the FPM Federal Program Monitoring Review process. We ask you to place your questions in the chat box, and we will answer any simple questions we can, but we will follow up with written responses in a Q&A that will be emailed to you. We are also recording today's training and we'll post this on our website. So for those of you that have friends that couldn't make it today, we will have it recorded and posted. And now Anita will share the outcomes for today.
Thank you, Adrienne. So let us begin by taking a look at our outcomes for the presentation. First, we will be focusing on understanding the district's role and responsibilities for equitable services, and that includes requirements related to the design, the implementation, and the evaluation of program services, as well as fiscal control of the program and program funds. Next, we will spend some time looking at how to determine the proportional share for individual programs, as the share does vary by program. Consultation is a critical component of equitable services, and with this in mind, we're going to spend a good amount of time on consultation requirements, which are specified in law. And finally, we will leave you with some places where you can find additional resources that will support you as you embark on providing equitable services to students at nonprofit private schools. And speaking of resources, we do have a comprehensive handbook available to add to your SFP library. And this user-friendly and informative handbook includes ESEA requirements for equitable services related to all applicable federal programs, including recent updates and clarifications as of March of this year. And in this handbook, you'll find Q&As to get you started or on track, requirements related to the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, also known as EDGAR, fiscal regulations, and the step-by-step process of the consultation requirement, which seems to be a common FPM finding. Now, there are separate sections addressing the differences in requirements for various federal programs, such as Title I, Part A and C, Title II, Title III, and Title IV, Parts A and B. And in addition, you'll have electronic access to sample forms and support materials that you can use for consultation and documentation purposes. You'll be able to edit and personalize the documents for your needs. And the link on this slide will take you to the order form, and you can also access it from the LACO website, but the link is the easiest route. And now for a historical overview, my favorite part. If you are new to equitable services, you might be asking yourself, now how do we get to this place where federal funds provide services that reach out beyond the public school and into the nonprofit private school sector? And that's a great question, and its answer can be found by looking back at the historical context. And we share this information because it's helpful for you to understand why we do the things that we do. And so let's take a look at how we got here. In 1962, President Kennedy appointed Harvard's School of Education Dean, Francis Keppel, to be the U.S. Commissioner of Education. Now, Keppel was known for his dynamic personality, and he had a knack for building relationships and putting people at ease. And just a few years later, Keppel's strength and his interpersonal intelligence would serve President Lyndon B. Johnson very well. Now, President Johnson's war on poverty included what was to become the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And this piece of legislation was very personal to Johnson since he had grown up in poverty and credited education for taking him out of it. But he hit some major roadblocks at the onset of trying to get the legislation passed. And one of those roadblocks was over services to private schools. Now, teacher unions and organizations at the time were opposed to providing funding to private schools. On the other hand, private school organizations and church groups were not opposed to the idea and threatened to block the passage of this act if they weren't included. So enter Frank Keppel. He came up with a compromise that satisfied all of the advocacy groups. And his compromise was that federal funds would not go to private schools. Instead, Keppel helped to ensure the legislation was designed in such a way that all children in need at public and non-public schools would be served. And so the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed in 1965, and getting all sides to a consensus was known as Keppel's Compromise. And it's hard to believe that next month we will be celebrating ESEA's 60th year anniversary. So as you can well imagine, things weren't smooth sailing for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, even after Keppel's compromise. In 1971 saw the landmark Supreme Court case Lemon versus Kurtzman. Now, this lawsuit came about over the First Amendment Establishment Clause, which requires that government maintain neutrality towards religion. And from this case, a three-pronged test was developed for Establishment Clause cases. Services to private schools had to be secular, they could not advance or inhibit religion, and there could be no entanglement of government agencies with religious organizations. And this three-pronged test became known as the Lemon Test. In 1985, there was another court case, Grand Rapids School District versus Ball. And in that case, the Supreme Court found that the Grand Rapids School District program did not pass the Lemon Test because the Equitable Services program employed parochial school teachers and used both public and religious school facilities. In addition, the secular classes were offered to children at parochial facilities that were leased by the state. Too much entanglement. And during that same year, the verdict in Aguilar versus Felton prohibited services at private schools. Teachers and staff were not allowed to go onto the private school site, and so lots of money was spent on portable buildings and trailers that were used to house the Title I program at that time. But then in 1997, a new case, Agustini versus Felton, reversed that ruling and now allowed public school teachers to go onto the campuses of private schools to provide secular equitable services. Now, this back and forth was feeling a lot like pickleball. And although these cases provided much needed clarification, they didn't stop the concerns of the Department of Education and what they saw in the administration of equitable services. In 2010, the United States Department of Ed did a review of California's programs, and they found several issues that really became a compliance focus. For one, consultation with nonprofit public schools was not taking place appropriately. Basically, school districts were offering services just to private school children, but they weren't consulting with the private school in that process. Next, districts were not maintaining control of the program and services, which is a requirement of the law, and districts were not determining equitable share accurately. Also, services provided were benefiting the private school. Services cannot benefit the private school, only the eligible students. And evaluations of the services and programs were not taking place, and selection criteria was not effective. And so hence in 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act made some additional changes to the Title I formula, added some requirements for consultation, it clarified some of the carryover requirements, and it added a state ombudsman. So let's take a look at that role now. So the ombudsman, or in California's case, the ombudswoman, was added to ensure that private school children, teachers, and other personnel receive the services equitably in comparison to public schools. Essentially, the ombudsman is sort of the intermediary between the private school and the school district when there are issues, questions, or disputes. Our Equitable Services Ombudsman is Sylvia Hanna, and she can be reached at the email listed on this slide. She's the person to contact if you have any questions, if you anticipate a problem, or you just aren't sure of something. She may be contacted by either the administrator from the LEA, from the school district, or from the private school. Now, there is a CDE Equitable Services Ombudsman webpage, and it provides you program contacts for other federal programs that require equitable services, along with other pertinent information. And so now that we reviewed how equitable services came about, learned about some of the back and forth, pickleball issues and the need for an ombudsman, we get to, in a nutshell, okay, what are equitable services? So equitable services refer to educational services and resources that are provided to eligible students and teachers in eligible nonprofit private schools using federal education program funds. Now, ESSA requires that access to equitable services be offered to eligible private school students, teachers, their families, and other educational personnel. However, participation by the private school, the nonprofit private school, is not required. Services provided must also be allowable and comparable to those services provided to public school students and teachers participating in the program. The services can be different from those services provided to public school participants, as services are based on the needs of the private school students and teachers, and services must also be evaluated for effectiveness. It's also important to note that any services provided must be secular, neutral, and non-ideological, and services must also supplement and in no case supplant the basic level of services that the nonprofit private school is responsible for providing to their students, staff, and parents. Additionally, funds may not be provided directly to the private nonprofit school. Equitable services only apply to federal funds and not to any state funds. And listed on this slide are the ESSA programs to which they do apply. Title I Part A, Title I Part C, Title II Part A, Title III, Title IV Part A, Title IV Part B, Project Serve. As you can see, most are formula grant programs, with the exception of Title IV Part B, which is the 21st Century Schools program, which is a competitive grant. Now, the requirements for each of the programs we saw on the previous slide follow the program requirements for public schools, with some exceptions regarding allowability of cost. As with the public school programs, the services are to be supplemental in nature and provide similar types of services. These are some important questions to ask, however. Does the service or program increase academic achievement? Is the program offered for professional development based on the needs of students? And what supplemental programs are being provided for identified ELs and immigrant students? What is the supplemental Title IV program? And does it support a well-rounded education? Does it improve school conditions for student learning or effective use of technology? The bottom line is that you don't start with the funding. You start with the needs of students and the services that will increase academic achievement. As you will see later in this presentation, Title I is significantly different in how funding is determined and how services are provided. This is primarily because Title I is a school-level program, so eligibility is based on individual students and whether or not they reside in the attendance area of a district-identified Title I public school. For Title I only, you may need to service eligible students attending nonprofit private schools outside of the district boundaries. And in today's presentation, we will provide you with specifics regarding equitable services for Title I programs and the specifics for the rest of the federal programs, which do differ from Title I in this regard. So thank you so much for your attention thus far. And next, Rachel will be discussing the requirement for consultation. Rachel?
Thank you, Anita, and hello, everyone. So as Anita mentioned, in this section, we'll be taking a closer look at the consultation process. Under ESSA, LEAs are required to consult with private school officials regarding the provision of equitable services. And consultation is not something that just happens once a year. It's an ongoing process that involves discussions between public and private school officials related to the provision of equitable services for private school children and educators. Because it's an ongoing process, consultation must occur during the design and development of the program, as well as throughout implementation of the program. And so this consultation process, it really helps to establish clear guidelines regarding how equitable services will be provided for each of the applicable programs. This slide here provides an overview of the key components of the consultation process that we will be reviewing in this section. And so one important thing to keep in mind is that consultation is the responsibility of the school district. And the goal is to reach agreement on how to provide equitable and effective programs for eligible private school students, teachers, and their families. So the first step in the process is to identify eligible private schools. And only nonprofit private schools that have submitted an affidavit to the CDE may participate in equitable services. So there are two ways to access the list of eligible private schools. The first link provided on the slide will take you to the CDE website where you can access a list of all private schools with an affidavit on file. And the second link is a searchable database that allows a search by district for the private schools that are within the district's boundaries. A county password is required to access this database. And so we've included the password for LA County on the slide. And so if you're in another county, you'll have to contact the CDE private school office for your specific county password. And also be sure to filter the list for nonprofit private schools. One other thing to keep in mind is that the CDE does not verify the accuracy of the affidavit information provided by private schools. And the CDE expects districts to verify the accuracy of this information. So that would include student enrollment data and tax-exempt status. And this would be verified through the consultation process. Next slide, please. When identifying which schools are eligible to participate, keep in mind the requirements for Title I Part A are different than that of Title I Part C and also Titles 2, 3, and 4. For Title I Part A, nonprofit private schools both within and outside of the district's boundaries may be eligible to participate. And that's because funding and services are based on the student living in a Title I school attendance area. So for example, if you have a low-income student who lives in a Title I school attendance area in your district, but attends a nonprofit private school outside of your district boundaries, the student would generate funds for Title I services. However, keep in mind that poverty does not determine who actually receives Title I services. It only determines how much funding is available for services. For Title I Part C and also Titles 2, 3, and 4, only nonprofit private schools within the district boundaries may participate. So this slide references question A5 from the Title I non-regulatory guidance, and it explains which private schools must be contacted for Title I Part A. And so the response indicates that for Title I Part A, LEAs are responsible for contacting private schools within the district boundaries and must additionally contact private schools outside of the district boundaries if the LEA has reason to believe that students who reside in its Title I attendance public school areas attend those private schools that are outside of the district boundaries. So that means you don't have to contact all private schools outside of your district boundaries, but if you know of or have reason to believe that your students who live in your Title I attendance areas attend certain private schools outside of your boundaries, then you are responsible for reaching out to those specific schools. So once you've checked the CDE list and identified eligible nonprofit private schools, the next step is to contact them to inform them of the programs and services for which their students, teachers, and families may be eligible. And so again, keep in mind that this is a district responsibility, and it's also something that must be done on an annual basis. It's recommended that districts reach out to eligible private schools around February to begin consultation early enough to prepare for the next school year. And so most districts use some sort of invitation letter or an intent to participate form to initiate that contact with the private schools. And so in this letter, you would include a brief description of the applicable programs for which your district participates. And you may also request that the private school indicate their intent to participate in any or all applicable programs. It's also good to include a deadline as long as you provide adequate time for private schools to respond. And so then you would then follow up with an informational meeting regarding the programs. Now, if you don't receive a response from private school officials, you should make multiple attempts to contact the private school. And also be sure to maintain documentation of those attempts to contact private school officials. And so it's a good idea to send letters or communication by certified mail, or if you're sending it via email, send it with a red receipt. And so this way you can document that it was actually received or read by the private school official. And on the next few slides, we have some screenshots of a few sample outreach letters that we've included with today's materials to assist you with this process. So here is a sample letter that can be used to reach out to nonprofit private schools within your district boundaries. And so for this letter, you would just include those federal programs that your LEA operates. And so here we have two sample letters to assist you with reaching out to private schools that are outside of your district. And again, this is only for Title I Part A. And so the first sample letter, it can be used to reach out to Title I directors in your adjoining districts. And so the letter asks Title I directors in adjoining districts if they could ask private school officials as they're consulting with them if the private school has any students from your district. And it also provides a format for sharing this information with you. Now, it's not required that you contact directors in adjoining districts, but many districts do this as a way to assist each other in identifying students who live in their attendance area, but are attending private schools in adjoining districts. And the second sample letter can be used to reach out to nonprofit private schools outside of your district boundaries, again, only for Title I, Part A. And so it's similar to the letter on the previous slide, but only includes information related to Title I. And so again, you would send this letter to private schools outside of your district if you have reason to believe that students who live in your Title I attendance areas are attending these schools. So as mentioned, the intent to participate letter should be followed up with an informational meeting. And this is to provide more specific information about the programs that private school students, teachers, and families may be eligible to participate in, as well as the procedures for participating. And so some of the topics that could be addressed at this initial meeting are included on the slide. And so, for example, it will be important to explain the consultation process, as well as the required topics that must be addressed through consultation. And so some other possible topics include explaining the purpose of the federal programs available, and also the services that are allowed under each program. Also explaining that the district is responsible for developing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating the programs. Another topic would be providing funding estimates for the next school year and the process that's used to determine private school participants' proportional share. Also providing information on district policies and procedures such as contracts and encumbrance deadlines. And then it would also be important to verify the name and contact information for the private school official designated to represent the private school. And then lastly, it would be important to schedule future meetings and timelines for consultation. And so really this initial meeting, it should set the tone for your consultation with private school officials. And it should convey the message that it's about designing equitable and effective programs for eligible students, teachers, and families based on the needs of students. And that it's not about the private school just sending the district a list of what they want. So as mentioned, consultation is an ongoing process. And so in order to ensure that consultation is timely and meaningful, it must begin early enough to prepare for the next school year. And consultation, it must occur before the district makes any decision that can impact the participation of private school students, teachers, other educational personnel, and families. And again, it must be ongoing throughout the year, and this is to ensure effective implementation as well as the evaluation of services. It's also important to keep in mind that a unilateral offer of services by a district with no opportunity for discussion or the application of a blanket rule, that is not adequate consultation. And so private school officials, they must have the opportunity to express their views and also to have those views considered. So when consulting with private school officials regarding equitable services, there are required topics that must be addressed per ESSA. And so the topics listed on this slide are required for all federal programs. So during these ongoing discussions and meetings, district and private school officials will need to discuss how the private school students' needs will be identified. Also, what services will be offered and how, where, and by whom will they be provided. Also, how the services will be assessed and how those results will be used to improve services. The size and scope of services, including the proportional share, and how that amount is determined. And then also how and when the district will make decisions related to the delivery of services. So here we see a continuation of those required consultation topics. And so the first three on the slide are required for all federal programs, and the last three topics on the slide are only applicable to Title I, Part A. And so if the LEA disagrees with the private school officials on the provision of services through a contract, the LEA must provide in writing to the private school official the reason why it disagrees. Consultation must also address whether the LEA will provide services directly or through a contract with a third-party provider, and whether to provide equitable services by pooling funds or on a school-by-school basis. One important thing to note is that LEA and private school officials must agree to the pooling funds through consultation, and the LEA may not unilaterally make the decision to pool funds. And so for Title I, Part A only, consultation will also need to address the method that will be used to determine low-income children. Also, when services will be provided, including the approximate time of day, and whether to consolidate Title I equitable services funds with funds available under other programs. And so keep in mind that this does not mean that LEAs are able to consolidate funds across programs, but rather coordinate the use of funds to maximize services. And so here we see a few other topics that should be discussed in the consultation process. And so that includes administrative and indirect costs, any funds available for carryover, and if the LEA is transferring funds from Title II or Title IV. So if an LEA is engaging in consultation, providing equitable services, and meeting the obligation of funds requirement, then generally there shouldn't be any carryover. However, in some cases, there may be extenuating circumstances that could result in a carryover of funds. So for example, services might be delayed due to a natural disaster. And so in this case, if the required equitable services were not fully provided, the funds would need to be carried over to provide equitable services the following year, in addition to the proportional share for that year. Also keep in mind that before transferring any funds from Title II or Title IV, the LEA must engage in timely and meaningful consultation with private school officials regarding the transfer in order to identify and consider the needs of private school children. So districts must also maintain documentation that verifies that it has met the requirement for timely and meaningful consultation and that it has provided equitable services. And so this documentation, it includes intent to participate letters, written affirmations of consultation, any evidence of consultation attempts. And so again, as mentioned, in order to document your outreach to private schools, districts should ensure that any communication that's mailed should be sent via certified mail, and then anything emailed should be sent with read receipts. Other documentation that must be maintained includes meeting agendas and minutes, any written explanations of disagreements, data collected to assess or evaluate services, any service agreements or contracts with third-party providers or vendors, monitoring and assessment tools, inventory records for materials purchased, property or other equipment purchased, and the identification criteria used to determine student eligibility for Title I services. So here we see some screenshots of the CDE's intent to participate and written affirmation. And so we've also included the link to access this form at the bottom of the slide. And so as mentioned, most districts use some sort of intent to participate form to make that initial contact with private schools. And so it's important to obtain a copy of the intent to participate form from each private school, whether or not that private school intends to participate. And so you would begin the consultation process with the private schools that have indicated their intent to participate. Districts are also required to maintain in its records a written affirmation signed by each nonprofit private school to document that timely and meaningful consultation has occurred. And private school officials, they must have the option to indicate their belief that timely and meaningful consultation has not occurred or that the program design for private school participants is not equitable. And this information, it must be reported to the CDE through the nonprofit private school consultation page that gets submitted with the spring CONAP in June. And so here you can see a screenshot of that nonprofit private school consultation page that gets submitted with the spring CONAP. And so you can see on this form, LEAs are asked to indicate for each nonprofit private school if consultation occurred, also if consultation agreement was met, if there is a signed written affirmation on file, and also to provide a consultation code indicating the private school's belief that timely and meaningful consultation has or has not occurred, or if the program design is not equitable. And so keep this in mind as you're beginning the consultation process with private schools for programs and services for the 2025-26 school year. You'll be reporting this information to the CDE through the spring CONAP submission coming up in June. And also just be sure to maintain documentation from private schools that decline services, as well as documentation of multiple attempts of outreach to those private schools that don't respond to you. So here is a sample private school consultation timeline that has been adapted from a sample CDE timeline. And so the link to the CDE sample, it's included at the bottom of the slide for your reference. And so again, it's recommended that districts begin this process for the next year's services in February to ensure that services begin in a timely manner. And then also remember, as mentioned several times, consultation should be ongoing throughout the year. And so you'll notice there may be some overlap during the year where you're consulting with private school officials on both the current year's services as well as the services for the next school year. And so here's another resource that we've included with today's materials to assist you with the consultation process. It's a checklist that combines all of the steps and components shared in this section today. And so hopefully this will be a helpful tool as you begin the consultation process for next year's services. And so just in a nutshell, consultation is really key to implementing effective programs. Again, it must be timely and meaningful. It must take place before the LEA makes any decisions, and it must be ongoing throughout the school year. And so the goal of public and private school officials should be to reach agreement on the provision of equitable services. And all agreements should be clear, in writing, and form the basis of services to be provided and funds to be expended. And so effective consultation, it will help to ensure that the services provided meets the needs of eligible students, teachers, and families. And it will also help to avoid those last-minute spending requests from private school officials. And so that concludes my section. I will now turn it over to Augustine.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. So this next section on proportional share for equitable services will be divided into two parts. So first, I'll go over proportional share and the Title I Part A program, and I'll be followed by Debbie, who will go over proportional share and other federal programs. So proportional share refers to the specific portion of an LEA's Title I Part A funds that must be set aside for eligible private school students based on their proportion of the total number of eligible students, both public and private, residing in the LEA. So let's begin. So the proportional share ensures that there's equitable participation of private school students, teachers, families, and other educational personnel as defined in ESSA Section 1117 for Title I and ESSA Section 8501 for the other title programs that Debbie will cover. These services are also considered to be equitable when the district meets the expenditure requirements of the federal program and when the district provides a timely program that meets the educational needs of the participants. So here are some key points about funding for Title I equitable services. So first of all, the proportional share must be calculated from the total amount of the Title I allocation that the district receives. It must be taken first off the top and set aside for equitable services. The funds must be used to implement the Title I program in the same fiscal year that the district receives them. The amounts are verified through the CONAP, and the state also notifies the private schools of the allocation of funds. And there are specific methods that must be followed in determining the federal program funding for nonprofit private schools. The first step in determining how much Title I Part A funding will be available for providing services to these nonprofit private schools is to determine the proportional share. Determining the proportional share depends on the federal program because, as it's been mentioned earlier, the methodology for Title I is significantly different from the other federal programs. It can be a bit confusing because for Title I, the proportional share is based on where the student lives as compared to the methodology for the other programs, which depends on the location of the private schools that are in the district's boundaries. So in order to determine the Title I proportional share, first, you need to identify the private school students who will be generating the funding. You'll need to know who the low-income families are in the eligible private schools within your district and in adjoining districts. Next, you'll need to consult with private schools in order to determine what method you'll use to measure the poverty level. So together, you're going to decide if you're going to use the same data as public school students, which in most cases it's free and reduced price meal data, or a survey of private schools parents asking for income data, or a low-income percentage of each participating public school attendance area. This is referred to as proportionality, or an equated measure of low income correlated with the measure of low income used to count public school children. After you've agreed on what method you'll be used to measure poverty, you'll need to collect the poverty data from private school families. The poverty data will need to be filtered in order to collect the number of students ages 5 through 17 who are from low-income families and attend the eligible private schools. If needed, you will need to provide the private school with the income eligibility forms to be used. Okay, so let's practice using the formula for proportional share to determine the equitable expenditures using this example right here on the screen. So let's say the number of the LEA's low-income students is 1,350, and the number of participating nonprofit private school low-income students is 150. If we add these two, we get 1,500 total low-income students. So now, to get our proportional percentage rate, we take our 150 private school low-income students and divide that by our total of 1,500 students. We get 1/10, or 10%. If the LEA's total Title I Part A entitlement is $1 million and 10% of that is taken off the top, then the private school proportional share is $100,000. So now, if the district's Title I Part A allocation is over $500,000, which in this example it is, then the LEA must reserve an equal percentage with a required minimum of 1% from the equitable services proportional share to carry out parent and family engagement activities of participating nonprofit private school students. And as you can see, the minimum 1% reservations for parent and family engagement in the private schools is $1,000. After the parent and family engagement reservation, the amount the LEA shall allocate for equitable services is $99,000. So here's what the proportional share work will look like on the CONAP. So the arrow is pointing to the field where the sum of public and nonprofit private school low-income students is inputted. Here, the CONAP will calculate the proportional percentage rate. In this case here, 91 nonprofit private school students divided by 254 total participating public and nonprofit private school low-income students gives us a proportional percentage rate of 35.83%. The next section of the private school equitable services reservations page from the CONAP is where you can find the proportional share dollar amount. This will calculate the proportional share of your equitable services reservation. So again, we take our PPR, which was 35.83%, and multiply it by the total Title I Part A LEA allocation of $551,483. This gives us an equitable services proportional share of $197,596. So next, here's a screenshot from the bottom of the private school equitable services reservations page of the Khan app. This is where the Khan app addresses parent engagement. So as you can see, the minimum required reservation for parent and family engagement based off the proportional share on the last slide is $1,976. This LEA's public school parent and family engagement reservation was set at 5.6%, requiring the same percentage to be allocated for parent and family engagement at participating nonprofit private schools. As a result, $11,152 was reserved for this purpose. Okay, so now let's do a little guided practice to determine who generates Title I Part A funding for the nonprofit private schools. So in the blue is your district. Your district has a Title I school and a non-Title I school within its boundaries. So now let's look at the private schools. There are private schools whose physical location is within your district boundaries. And in the gray, you can see other private schools and districts that are adjoining or surrounding your district. So now let's look at those 6 students on the screen. Let's say they're all low-income students, right? So students 1 through 3 live in the attendance area of the Title I school. And then students 4 through 6, well, they live in the attendance area of the non-Title I school. The arrows indicate which private school they're attending. I want you to notice that students 3 and 4 are attending the same private school in a surrounding district. Students 1, 2, and 3 all live in the Title I school attendance area. Because they live in the Title I school attendance area, all 3 of these low-income students will generate Title I Part A funding no matter which nonprofit private school they attend. Remember, it's where the student resides that determines whether or not they generate funding for private schools. Now let's look at students 4, 5, and 6. They all live in a non-Title I school attendance area. All 3 of these low-income students will not generate any funding for the private school because they live in the attendance area of a non-Title I school. Additionally, you can see at the private school in surrounding District 3 there at the bottom, will have some low-income students that generate funding and other low-income students that do not generate funding. So, all right, so now that we determined the Title I funding, who receives the academic services? So we need to identify which students will receive the Title I services. ESSA and the Code of Federal Regulations state that Title I services are for students attending participating in nonprofit private schools identified by the LEA as failing or most at risk of failing and reside in the LEA participating school attendance area. It's these students that are eligible for equitable services. And here's some key reminders when identifying students for services. So remember, they must reside in the Title I attendance area. They must meet multiple educationally related objective criteria agreed to in consultation. So a couple of these examples are like the Iowa assessments or the iReady assessments. Also, please be aware that there are some students who reside in Title I school attendance area that are automatically eligible. Those are our homeless youth, our students at Head Start, Even Start, Title I Pre-K, migrant program, or children in a local institution for neglected or delinquent children, or youth attending a community day program for such children in the last 2 years. Lastly, it's important to remember that poverty is not a criterion for receiving these services. So now, when you're providing these Title I Part A services, remember that they must be based on a needs assessment and with consultation, that they're run using the Title I Targeted Assistance School Model. And if you're hiring your own district employees to provide these Title I services, they must meet the state credential requirements. And lastly, you're implementing your Title I program. You just can't provide the materials and supplies and then be in compliance with federal requirements. Remember, it's not a pot of money, it's a program. Okay, so let's check for understanding here. Who generates funding and who receives services? Here we have 3 students, Aria, Cosmo, and Win. So take a minute to analyze each student profile to determine if A, they generate funding, and B, are eligible to receive Title I services. Give you about 27 seconds to jot down your ideas, or if you feel compelled to, please drop it in the chat. But go ahead and take 27 seconds to analyze these profiles. All right, we can go to the next slide, please. So let's start with Aria. And so this student is a low-income student that lives in a Title I school attendance area and is high achieving. Does Aria generate funding? Yes. Does Aria receive Title I services? No, because Aria is not failing or most at risk of failing as defined in ESSA and the Code of Federal Regulations. So what about Cosmo? This student is a low-income student that does not live in a Title I school attendance area and is low achieving. So does Cosmo generate funding? Nope. And does Cosmo receive Title I services? Unfortunately, no. Cosmo would not receive Title I services because based on where they live, they would be attending your non-Title I school. And finally, let's take a look at Win. So this student is a high-income student that lives in the Title I school attendance area and is low achieving. Does Win generate funding? No. But does Win receive Title I services? Yes, because they are failing or most at risk of failing as defined in ESSA and the Code of Federal Regulations. So I'm sure you all did great. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you for your engagement. Now I'll pass it over to Debbie, who will cover Equitable Share and our other federal programs.
Thank you, Augustine. Good morning, everyone. As Augustine shared, I will be going over the other federal programs. Next slide. So our other federal programs and they differ from Title I Part A because with Title I Part C and Titles 2, 3, and 4, you will only serve the nonprofit private schools that are located within your boundaries. So there is no requirement to contact private schools outside your district boundaries for these programs as it is with Title I Part A. Next slide. Okay. So here's a graphic that illustrates which private schools will be served by your district for Title I Part C, Title II, Title III, and 4. In this scenario, your district is in the middle, indicated by DO with the black boundaries around it. There are a number of private schools near your district office. So which private schools do you need to reach out to? Those that are within your boundaries, within the black boundaries. You only reach out to those private schools for these programs. This contrasts Title I Part A because, as Augustine explained, with Title I Part A, you also reach out to private schools in the surrounding districts because the services follow the students who reside within your district's Title I attendance area. Okay, next slide, please. So I just want to mention that every one of these have different requirements, and so it is not all the same. So we don't expect you to memorize this. Of course, this is a reference for you early to refer back to, but we're going to go over the details of each. So Title I Part C is the education of migratory children. So the CDE, the Migrant Education Program Regions and Migrant Education Program LEAs assist participating nonprofit private schools in identifying migrant education students. Migrant education programs funds are used to provide supplemental services or other benefits on an equitable basis to eligible migrant children and their teachers and other educational personnel. So these services must be determined through one consultation and must be based on student needs. Some examples of services and allowable activities include after-school intervention, health services, parent workshops, and professional development for teachers of these eligible students. And again, as mentioned before by my colleagues, these must be secular, neutral, and non-ideological. Next slide, please. So here we see a screenshot of the method of calculating equitable services proportional share for Title I Part C. And for Title I Part C, a per pupil amount is determined based on the district's total Title I Part C allocation. You take that total divided by the number of migrant education program students enrolled in both the public and participating nonprofit private schools. You would then multiply the per pupil rate by the number of private school migrant education program participants to determine the equitable share. Next slide. Now, Title II, Part A, which is supporting effective instruction. The districts may use Title II, Part A funds to provide professional development activities for private school teachers, principals, and other instructional personnel to address the specific needs of their students. Services provided must be allowable under Title II and must also be supplemental to the professional development provided by the private school. One thing to remember is that the services for Title II are determined through the consultation process, and must also be based on student needs. The services must address the specific needs of students enrolled in the private school and not the general needs of the private school. A scenario to avoid is one in which the private school requests reimbursement for a conference they may already have attended, or request late registration for an upcoming conference that was not one that you had both discussed in prior consultation, nor was it determined to meet the specific needs of their students. The professional development plan for the Title II equitable service should be intentionally planned in advance through the consultation process. Some examples of professional development activities are included on the slide. And one of the questions we often receive regarding Title II is whether or not Title II funds could be used to pay for credential coursework. And as with most questions of this nature, it depends. So we recommend being extremely cautious with this. You would need to ensure that the coursework is tied to the professional development needs and your professional development plan. And again, the professional development must be secular, neutral, and non-ideological. Next slide, please. So how are the Title II Part A calculations made? We see a screenshot from the CDE method of calculating equitable services proportional share for Title II. And this document provides a step-by-step walkthrough of the process for determining the equitable share amount for Title II, and can be found on the CDE Ombudsman's webpage. And we've also included a link to the document. For Title II equitable services, a per pupil amount is determined based on the LEA's total Title II allocation, less administrative costs, and the total enrollment of all public and nonprofit private school students at participating nonprofit private schools. So it's only those that are participating, that's key. And you would then multiply the per pupil rate by the total enrollment of participating non-private school students to determine the amount for equitable services. Now moving on to Title III. In Title III, we have two parts, the Title III for the limited English learners and then Title III immigrant programs. For Title III English learners, the private school, this is a different process. The private school would need to first identify their students who are English learners, and they would do that through the home language survey, providing that to all students to be considered for participation. It should be the same version of the home language survey used by the district. If a language other than English is indicated on the home language survey, then the district is required to administer the initial language assessment. So the district is responsible for the cost and the oversight of this initial assessment. It is also important to note that the district cannot use the LCAP with the private school students. The CDE does have on their website has a list of approved tests that may be used to assess the English language proficiency of private school students. However, any test mutually agreed upon during the consultation that is valid and reliable for assessing English proficiency may be used. EL students at the private school must be assessed annually thereafter to determine to determine whether the support needs to be ongoing. Private schools may be eligible to participate in Title III immigrant if the private school submitted the Student's National Origin Report. That's what the report is called, and also known as the SNOR, with the number of eligible immigrant students and it is that are living located within the boundaries of the LEA. The students that are identified with the private school through the SNOR are then submitted to the CDE, their online reporting. A side note, the count of immigrant students in the district is not reported through the SNOR, it's reported through CalPADS. And for your reference, the ESSA defines immigrant students as students who are age 3 to 21 who were not born in the US or US territory and have been attending a school in the US for less than 36 cumulative months. So we've also included a link to the CDE webpage here for additional information on equitable services for Title III EL and immigrant programs. Next slide, please. Title III funds are meant to provide supplemental language instruction services for English learners and support for immigrant students. Through the consultation process, the district and each private school will determine a memorandum of understanding that, at a minimum, describes the services and products to be provided and the estimated cost and the dates of their provision. Some examples of services include assessing English learners, small group instruction, after-school tutoring, professional development for teachers of English learners or immigrant students. Next slide, please. Here we see another screenshot from the CDE for their method of calculating equitable services proportionate share for Title III. This document provides the process for determining the equitable share amount for Title III and can be found on the CDE's webpage. And the link is provided there again on the bottom of the slide. For Title III, the proportional share is calculated based on the per pupil allocation for the EL and/or immigrant students enrolled in both public and participating nonprofit private schools. Also remember that there is a 2% cap on administrative costs for Title III. The private schools should receive an equitable amount of products and services for each of the EL and immigrant students served at the public school students that are receiving those funds. Next slide, please. One last note regarding Title III funding is that the LEA is paid in arrears, or in other words, they are reimbursed for its services to private school students. So the CDE collects the data in CONAP on the number of nonprofit private school EL and immigrant students served in the current year, and they add this number to the public school counts when calculating the following year's award amount. In order to they do this in order to reimburse the LEA for services provided to the EL and immigrant students. Okay, next slide, please. Now, Title IV Part A. The purpose of Title IV Part A is to provide students a well-rounded educational opportunities, improve school conditions for student learning, and improve the use of technology, improve the academic achievement and digital literacy of all students. Private school services may focus on one or more of these areas. However, this must be determined through the consultation with private school officials and be based on the student needs. It's also important to note that the percentage requirements that apply to each of the Title IV program areas for LEAs that receive over $30,000 in Title IV funds do not apply to private schools. The percentage requirements only apply to the LEA overall. Some example of Title IV services that are listed on the slides, such as college and career guidance counseling, school-based mental health services, and professional development on effective use of technology, just to name a few. And again, they must be secular, neutral, and non-ideological. Next slide. So here's a screenshot again of the methods for calculating equitable services, which like the sample shows for the other programs, provides a walkthrough of the process for determining the equitable share amount. And here with Title IV, Part A, equitable share, districts will be determined by per pupil amount based on the LEA's total Title IV allocation, less administrative and indirect costs, and the total number of enrollment, both public and nonprofit private school students. So we've included a link to the CDE Title IV webpage, which provides additional information on Title IV. So this concludes my section. Now I'm going to turn it over to Helen and Jeannie.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Debbie. So this part of our presentation, we are going to reiterate and remind you of some of the key requirements of equitable services. So please remember that the funds allocated to the LEA for equitable services and other benefits to eligible nonprofit private school students, teachers, and other educational personnel and families must be obligated in the fiscal year for which the funds are received. And keep in mind that the fiscal year for federal funds go until September 30th. So during your consultation, please consider this timeline to which the private school may be seeking services. For example, if a private school would like to do a summer program, LEA should consider it during consultation. And as mentioned several times today, right? All services must be secular, neutral, and non-ideological and supplemental, and the costs must be allowable, necessary, and reasonable. One key component to remember is that the funds cannot benefit the private school. This means that the funding is not eligible for general use. Funding cannot finance existing level of instruction in private schools or otherwise benefit the school itself. So the allowable uses must be agreed upon and support program implementation, including specific strategies to support eligible students to achieve academic outcomes that are determined through the consultation. And this means that in order to plan appropriate services, it would require an understanding of the existing level of instruction or the private school's core program. What instruction, including those for ELs, what services, equipment, materials, and professional developments are already in place? Based on the needs of eligible private school students, what services would best meet their needs? If purchasing equipment or materials, these should not be intended to benefit the entire school, but only for the programs for the eligible students. Therefore, the districts in consultation with the private schools would also discuss controls for unauthorized uses. And to reiterate, public control of funds means that the LEA must retain control of the funds for equitable services and titles to materials, equipment, and property purchased with such funds. In other words, no funds may go directly to a private school. So what does this look like? Under public control of services, services must be provided by employees of public agency or through a contract by public agency with individual association, agency, or organization. If during consultation, it is decided that a third-party contractor is to be used, the contract is between the LEA and the contractor, and it must be independent of the private school and of any religious organization, and the employment or contract must be under, again, the control of and supervision of the public agency. Private schools should not be the ones signing any contracts. Moreover, under ESSA, funds cannot be directly paid to the private schools. It is the LEA that will determine the proportional share of funds, as Debbie and Augustine mentioned, to be allocated for equitable services to participating private schools, and all curriculum, equipment, other materials purchased to implement these programs are the property of the LEA. Another aspect related to control of funds is the use of personnel to implement programs. If the private school personnel will be involved in the implementation of the programs, there are few things to remember. This is the district's program. Even if you are using private school teachers and therefore the services performed should be under the supervision of the district, meaning the program should be monitored and involve program visits. Through consultation, the plan for the use of private school personnel should clearly define the contract for services and ensure that the program and any related PD is outside the regular hours of the private school staff members' regular duties, because the funds cannot be used to finance the existing level of instruction, as we saw previously. In addition, the contract should be within line with the district's procedures and policies. If the plan is to use public schools personnel from your district, the services being provided should again be supplemental to their core instruction and for eligible students agreed upon through the consultation process. And now I'll turn it over to Jeannie for more information on other requirements and potential red flags.
Thanks, Helen. Let's continue with a few important fiscal control reminders related to staff implementing equitable services programs at private schools. Under the ESSA, no funds may be paid directly to the private school. So if private school teachers are hired by the LEA, they should only be working outside regular duty hours. And this is because the program cannot be used to finance existing services. With workshops and conferences, the district may reimburse the employee directly, but never the private school directly. And in such case, substitutes cannot be funded because the sub would be providing services for the benefit of the school and not specific to the program for eligible students. Also, for any payment to private school staff attending professional development, they must only be paid as stipend for hours attended outside their regular hours, and again, paid to the teacher, never to the private school. So some other fiscal reminders are offered here on this slide. Under ESSA, LEAs can charge reasonable and necessary administrative cost. Because proportional share is taken off the top of the total allocation, an LEA may reserve funds from the proportionate share for an amount that is reasonable and necessary to administer the program. This should be determined as part of consultation. In terms of carryover, ESSA requires the LEA to obligate funds for equitable services in the year for which they are appropriated. The process of consultation should ensure throughout the year that the intended plan is progressing and limit situations in which funds are left unspent. According to federal guidance, there may be extenuating circumstances in which the LEA is unable to obligate all funds, and then the funds must be used for equitable services the following year, and this would be subject to consultation. With supplement not supplant, services are not to take the place of instructional services at the school. The term "not to benefit the school" applies, so the general idea is that services cannot replace or finance the existing level of instruction at the school or basic services. With transferability, the key idea is that the district must consult with private schools before making any decisions to transfer funds. And also included here on this slide are interagency agreements. So because Title I Part A eligible students may attend private schools in adjoining districts, the LEA of residence may arrange to have services provided by another LEA. If the LEA makes such an arrangement, the two LEAs must establish an interagency agreement, which spells out the details of the reimbursement, indicating the per pupil amounts for the number of children served. The LEA of residence must then reimburse the LEA that provides the Title I services at the per pupil amount rate of the Title I Part A participating school attendance area of the child's residence. So we'll go on now to talk about some red flags. And in these next few slides, we'll consider a few scenarios. First, we consider a few problematic situations where use of funds would benefit the private school overall and not just specifically support the equitable services program intended to address the academic needs that were identified through consultation. For instance, consider the purchase of items for general use at the private school, such as library books, whiteboards for classroom, or computers and software placed in classrooms. These sorts of purchases provide an overall benefit to all students in the school, which is not an allowable use of Title I funds at private schools. Additional red flags include using Title I funds at private schools for general instructional or curricular workshops, or for general data analysis training for all teachers, or for providing general courses leading to teacher certification. In all these instances, the actions would benefit the entire school or entire classroom without regard to students' eligibility for services. Such uses of Title I funds clearly would not focus on the targeted program designed through consultation that addresses the specific needs of Title I students at the private school, and these are not allowed. Funding is not for general use. Allowable uses must be agreed upon and support program implementation, including specific strategies to support Title I students to achieve academic outcomes that are determined through the consultation process. Here, we consider some more red flags that can signal a lack of district control. For example, if the private school officials are signing timesheets, this is a red flag that the LEA is not maintaining their legal oversight for services being delivered as planned through consultation. If contractors are determining services that are going to be provided, this does not indicate district control. All services to be provided, whether by district employees or through employees contracted with the LEA to implement a specific program, need to be developed through consultation. Outside contractors should not be the ones who determine the programs to be provided or the areas to be addressed, and then charge the district for their services. Similarly, another red flag would be if the private school officials are telling the LEA that they arranged for PD and then are sending an invoice. If there was no discussion during consultation prior to the private school staff attending that particular PD, this would then signal that the PD was not provided as part of the program planned through consultation. Likewise, budgets and purchase orders submitted to the district from private school officials are problematic, as they do not reflect consultation for program development and related services to be provided. Sending invoices to the LEA makes apparent that the district is not maintaining control of the funds. All right, on our last red flag slide. Here, we're considering red flags indicating inadequate program evaluation. As part of the services that are planned through consultation, there's a requirement for districts to conduct program evaluation. If there is no program evaluation of equitable services in private schools, this is a red flag. Consultation that does not develop and include the process and metrics that will be used for evaluation to reflect on program implementation and effectiveness can be a first sign that the district is not prepared to, nor intending to evaluate the district programs at the private school as required. Additionally, without measurable benchmarks included and agreed upon when designing the program evaluation process during consultation, it will not be clear what data the LEA plans to use or how the LEA plans to analyze the results with the private school to inform the LEA and private school community about the impact of strategies and how to modify or improve the program for the following year. Just as is done in public schools, a program evaluation should impact the decisions for how equitable services are planned in the following year. And also, when data for program evaluation is limited to only collecting pre and post-test scores and does not include multiple measures and a process to reflect on multiple data sources and program implementation necessary to determine program effectiveness, it does not support the required and purposeful program evaluation. So I'll finish up this section addressing key requirements, addressing the complaint process. So a nonprofit private school official has the right to file a complaint to the state education agency that the LEA did not engage in consultation that was meaningful and timely, did not give consideration to the views of the nonprofit private school official, or did not make a decision that treats the nonprofit private school students equitably. If the LEA disagrees with the views of the private school officials with respect to an issue pertaining to consultation, the LEA should provide in writing to such private school officials the reasons why the LEA disagrees. So here we'll take a look at the steps in the complaint process for complaints addressing equitable services. At the consultation level, a private school may meet with the LEA and attempt to resolve the issue. They may also file a complaint with the LEA using the Uniform Complaint Procedure, or the private school may contact the state ombudsman to seek resolution for a complaint using the state complaint process. Uniform complaints are filed with the district superintendent or their designee for alleged violation of specific federal and state programs that use categorical funds, which includes complaints addressing the Every Student Succeeds Act. Depending on the outcome, a private school may appeal the decision of the state education agency to the U.S. Department of Education. The CDE Ombudsman has a frequently asked question addressing the complaint process, and it recommends that private school officials file a complaint with the LEA through the LEA Uniform Complaint Process, or they can file a complaint directly with the state education agency, the CDE through the state UCP, that's the Uniform Complaint Program Office. We'll conclude our presentation this morning with Adrian addressing the federal program monitoring process for equitable services.
Thank you, Jeannie. So moving on, we have the requirements that are related to the services to private schools that are under review by the California Department of Education. Districts are responsible for creating and maintaining programs which meet minimum fiscal and programmatic requirements. Federal and state laws require the CDE to monitor implementation of the categorical programs operated by the districts. The Federal Program Monitoring Reviews, also known as FPM, is the process for reviewing the district's implementation of their federal programs. So starting with compensatory education. So the evidence request for Title I program is in the CE instrument, and this is under CE3, private school consultation and participation. So the evidence that will be required will be the consultation that the private school took place, the intent to participate, which is what you get from the private school, and the private school affirmation. So these three pieces of evidence will be collected and submitted for review by CDE if you are selected for an FPM review. CE 17 is also an item in the compensatory education program instrument. And this is looking at the LEA's public control of funds. And so here you're providing evidence that will show funding allocation for the Title I school services, LEA's summary budget and expenditure reports for services to private school students, and any third-party contracts and invoices that the district has entered on behalf of that private school. Moving on to the Title II program, the Supporting Effective Instruction, the SEI instrument, specifically in SEI 3, here this is looking at reviewing and revising the Local Control and Accountability Plan Federal Addendum, and there's an assurance there that states that the LEA will comply with the participation by private schools and teachers. So again, this is a component within the LCAP Federal Addendum and the assurances that are signed when you take those funds with the intention to comply. SEI 8 specifically looks at private school participation, the consultation process, and the LEA's control of funds. So here for Title II, you're going to include the intent to participate, the consultation with private schools, the private school affirmation, the general ledger, and the invoices. So all of that for Title II is collected under SEI 8. For the Title III program, here it is captured actually in the compensatory education item program. And so in CE3, the private school consultation and participation, not only are you providing evidence that is showing for Title I consultation, but also for Title III. So your form would need to include the consultation with the private schools, the intent to participate, the private school affirmation showing that they are participating or not participating in Title III program. For the public control of funds for the private schools for the Title III program, again, it is reviewed and captured under the compensatory education program instrument. So in CE 17, along with what you're doing for CE 17 and Title I, you also would include your Title III program evidence. So this would show funding allocations for the Title III school services, the LEA summary budget and expenditure reports for services to private school students, and again, any third-party provider contracts and invoices that you've entered on behalf of the private school in regards to Title III program. And then moving on to Title IV, which is the Student Support and Academic Enrichment, also known as SSAE. In SSAE 6, it looks specifically at equitable services with Title IV funds and the program that's implemented. So the evidence requested for the Title IV program would include property records, again, the consultation with private schools, any approval of capital expenditures from the CDE, private school affirmation, needs assessment, general ledger, and invoices that are supporting the Title IV program at the private school. Additionally, SSAE 7, federal transferability. If indeed the district is going to transfer funds, again, there's evidence that needs to show that that there was a consultation with the private school, that the LEA level planning documents, and that the general ledger shows the, the fiscal trail and string of transactions showing the transferability. So again, making sure that you are consulting with the private schools to let them know that funds are being transferred so that there's transparency. So lastly, as we wrap up today's workshop, again, we want to thank you for being here. And we wanted to also provide a few little things that can make a difference and actually make a big difference. So first, we want to address the language that we use around equitable services. The language we use can make a big difference in the perception of both the public and the private schools officials engaged in this work. And while there might be a tendency to say things like, that's the private school's program, or the private school hasn't spent their money, changing our perspective and the language we use is extremely helpful in order to help everyone understand the true purpose. And so saying things like that, these are the services we have planned for private school students and teachers helps to underscore the importance of consultation and the district's control over the programs. And instead of referring to the private school's materials and equipment, we would say public school and private school officials would refer to the materials as being on loan from the district to support the services to eligible private school students. And remember, once those materials are no longer needed for those particular services, or the number of eligible students changes, the materials and the equipment need to be returned back to the district. As we conclude today's workshop, we have provided the next slide, please. As we conclude today's workshop, we have provided links to several resources on the equitable services. We have provided the CDE Equitable Services Ombudsman's webpage and it has quite a few resources, including the FAQs, links to the Equitable Services web pages for Title I, II, III, and IV, and also the method for calculating the Equitable Services proportional share for each program. And we've also included the links to the updated Title I Equitable Services non-regulatory guidance and the new Title VIII Equitable Services for those the non-regulatory guidance, which also applies to the other federal programs such as Title II, III, and IV. We thank you for being here today. We ask you that you please complete the evaluation for today's meeting by following the link or using the QR code on the slide. And as always, if you have any questions, please place them in the chat. And again, if we go back to the QR code and the evaluation slide, we really want to encourage you to take a few minutes so that you can give us some feedback that we greatly appreciate and use moving forward. And again, we want to thank you for all of your support in providing all these services to the students. And again, remember, it is all about the students. So thank you again, and have a great day.